What if I told you that the first terrorist attack in Australia was committed by Croatians? Yes, you heard correctly, but more specifically, Croatian ultranationalists and not some random Islamic fundamentalists. On George Street, Sydney, Australia, 1972, in one of the city's busiest districts, a bomb detonated that blew out the windows and sent shards of glass slicing into pedestrians outside. 16 people were critically injured, and just minutes later, as panic spread, a second explosion thundered just down the same street, leveling another building. The targets were two travel agencies, Adriatic Travel Centre and the Adria Travel Agency. Police and intelligence identified two men as the key suspects behind the attack, Anđelko Marić and Stepan Brbić, men aligned with one of the most feared fascist organizations ever to exist, the Ustaše. The targets weren't random. Both travel agencies promoted holidays to Yugoslavia, the homeland of these attackers. It turns out, for them, agencies promoting tourism to Yugoslavia was intolerable, and they believed that violence was the only way to send their message. And the George Street bombings wasn't the only act. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Australia witnessed a wave of Croatian extremist and terrorist violence, the likes not seen by Aussies before. Consulates were firebombed, churches attacked, even assassination plots uncovered. Sydney and Melbourne, cities with no history of terrorism in the 20th century, suddenly found themselves unwilling battlegrounds. And so the question must be asked, why were the first terrorist attacks in Australia committed by Croatians? What drove this campaign of violence? In today's video, we'll be exploring the roots of Croatian nationalism, where it stems from, the rise of the ultra-nationalist Ustaše movement, the notorious concentration camp Jasenovac, and the broader geopolitical forces that shaped it all. Welcome to The Sovereign Thinker. Like, share, and subscribe so you too can be a sovereign thinker. Thank you all who have donated, and with that said, let's dive in. Right off the bat, this sounds like a strange story, Croatian terrorists in Australia, but what most people don't realize is that Croatians have a long recorded history of brutality. One of the earliest examples dates back to the 17th of July, 1635, in Kaiserslautern, Germany, during the 30 Years' War, which was a massive conflict that started off initially as a war between Catholics and Protestants. In the midst of this war, the Catholic Habsburgs dispatched Croatian cavalry to storm Kaiserslautern. What became known as the Croatian Assault was, however, a massacre. Croatian soldiers stormed the fortress and slaughtered 1,500 of its inhabitants, all believed to be Protestants. A memorial stands as a stark reminder of the brutality shown by the Croatians, and Kaiserslautern was not the only place. Similar memorial crosses, shrines, and folk stories can be found in other towns and villages across Germany, especially across Protestant lands. So why do they do this? Well, it all boils down to their extreme loyalty to the Catholic Church. Keep this in mind, my fellow listeners, as we dive into this later on in the video. But for now, let's return to why Australia's first modern terrorist attack were carried out by Croatians and what pushed them to do this. To understand this story, we need to zoom out and look at the geopolitical picture. In the early 1970s, Yugoslavia was shaken up by what was called the Croatian Spring, a protest led by a segment of the Croatian population, or Croatian nationalists, among who were students, intellectuals, and even members of the Communist Party, and they demanded greater Croatian autonomy within Yugoslavia. But more often than not, such movements that start off peacefully turn more aggressive and even violent, and such was the case with the Croatian Spring, and so the movement was crushed. Josip Broz Tito, Yugoslavia's dictator, who was half Croatian and half Slovenian himself, had no tolerance for autonomy campaigns that might open the door to independence. The crackdown was swift and harsh. Leaders arrested, demonstrations broken up, the movement stamped out. This repression ignited outrage across the global Croatian diaspora. From Australia to North America, Croatians urged their host governments to denounce Tito and the Yugoslav regime. Yet in the West, the response was largely mute, marked by silence and at times even condemnation of Croatian activism. For the emigres, watching Western governments dismiss their cause felt like a bitter betrayal. Some, particularly in Australia, turned to violence in response, resulting in attacks like the one in George Street, Sydney. This in turn prompted the Australian government in 1973 to launch a crackdown on Croatian extremism. Terrorism by Croatian extremists has been carried out in Australia. This is not a matter which can be treated lightly. It is a matter that must be pursued with the utmost seriousness. Gough Whitlam, Prime Minister of Australia. What makes this history so striking is the contrast. Approximately 20 years later, in the 1990s, the West would loudly support Croatia's bid for independence as Yugoslavia fell apart. So why were Croatians dismissed in the 1970s but embraced in the 1990s? In my previous video on the breakup of Yugoslavia, I explained how the country was ultimately destroyed not by ancient ethnic hatred, but by foreign powers acting on geopolitical interests. To summarize, during the Cold War, Yugoslavia occupied a unique position between East and West. It was not in the Warsaw Pact, nor was it a member of NATO. This made Yugoslavia valuable as a buffer state. Neither Washington nor Moscow wanted to risk destabilizing it, so Yugoslavia enjoyed a rare freedom of maneuver, often pursuing its own interests even when they clashed with the superpowers. However, that get-out-of-jail-free card evaporated with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Once the Cold War ended, Yugoslavia's role as a buffer no longer mattered. Unlike its Eastern European neighbors, Belgrade resisted throwing in its lot with the West, and so instead of being preserved, Yugoslavia was dismantled. Serbians were cast as the villains, and separatist movements like Croatia's, ignored and condemned in the 1970s, suddenly found themselves enjoying Western backing in the 1990s. As I often say, my fellow listeners, if you want to get a better understanding of the world, the geopolitical lens often provides the most insightful answers. But why were the Croatians fighting to break away from Yugoslavia? Well, this brings me back to my crucial point regarding Croatia's extreme loyalty to the Catholic Church. To really understand Croatian nationalism, we need to talk about Catholicism and the outsized role it has played in shaping the Croatian national psyche. For centuries, religion has been the central pillar of Croatian identity, so much so that being Catholic became almost synonymous with being Croatian. Unlike some nations whose sense of identity rests on language, culture, political traditions, or institutions, Croatia's identity was forged at a religious frontier, situated between Catholic Austria and Hungary to the north, and to the east their brothers Orthodox Serbia, and of course later on the advancing Ottoman world. Croats defined themselves above all as the frontline Catholics belonging to the wider Catholic civilization. This religious marker became their rallying point and eventually the foundation of their nationalist ambitions. In this sense, Croatian nationalism often appeared less about building a distinct civic nation and more about drawing a reactionary hard line of identity. We are Catholic, therefore, we are not Serbian. In other words, Croatians are heavy victims of permanent presence, the geopolitical strategy by which foreign powers deploy religion, ideology, politics, culture, and other forms of soft power to transform conquered peoples into loyal subjects. The goal of permanent presence is to ensure that the occupied identify with the occupier, reducing the risk of rebellion and fostering assimilation into the empire. Centuries of Catholic influence, reinforced by domination under Catholic powers such as Venice, Hungary, Austria, and the Vatican, left Croatians identifying more closely with these foreign rulers as opposed to their own kin, the Orthodox Serbians, who were increasingly being seen as the other. It's important to highlight this because even if modern-day Croatians are not especially religious anymore, the effects of permanent presence still shape how they perceive themselves and their place in the world. Life on the front lines of Catholic Europe often sharpened identity into something rigid and uncompromising, producing communities that were zealous, defensive, and fiercely determined to preserve what set them apart. Their frontier position demanded not only military resilience, but also an uncompromising commitment to Catholicism. The fusion of Catholicism and Croatian identity reached one of its darkest expressions during the Second World War with the rise of the Ustaše, the feared fascist organization I mentioned at the start of the video. Founded in the 1920s by Antepavelić, a lawyer and politician from Zagreb who fled to Italy from Yugoslavia when King Alexander I established a royal dictatorship to crack down on nationalist movements. While in Italy, the Ustaše emerged as an ultra-nationalist fascist movement trained in guerrilla warfare, bomb-making, and sabotage tactics. From there, Pavelić and his followers envisioned the creation of a pure Catholic Croatian state. This vision left no place for Jews, Roma, and above all, Serbian Orthodox Christians, who were cast as the principal internal enemy. In 1941, during the Second World War, Germany and Italy invaded and dismantled the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and shortly after, the Ustaše were brought to power. With Nazi and fascist backing, Pavelić proclaimed the Independent State of Croatia. On paper, it was a sovereign state, but in reality, it was a puppet regime propped up by both Berlin and Rome. To many Croatian nationalists, this was the long-awaited realization of independence, a state bound tightly to Catholicism and militant nationalism. The Ustaše quickly revealed the true nature of their project, even shocking their German and Italian allies. They launched a campaign of terror aimed at Jews in Roma, but most of all against Serbians. Their official policy was 1/3 of Serbians were to be forced converted to Catholicism, 1/3 to be exiled, and 1/3 to be massacred. The justification was that this was a crusade to defend Catholic Croatia from Orthodox Serbia and other undesirables. This was not a marginal phenomenon. It was central to how the Ustaše sought to engineer their new society. General Edmund Glaze von Horstenau, who was Berlin's official representative to Croatia at the time, stated on the 28th of June 1941, the Ustaše have gone raving mad, in his report to the OKW, or the German High Command, who Hitler himself was a frequent participant. This report explained how the Wehrmacht frequently faced tensions between their orders to maintain order in Yugoslavia and the brutality shown by the Ustaše, and on the 10th of July 1941, General Horstenau followed up with a more detailed assessment. Our troops have been mute witnesses of such brutal events. I am frequently told that German occupation forces will have to intervene against Ustaše crimes. This may happen eventually. And eventually, in some cases, this indeed happened. The Italian army stepped in August 1941 to protect Serbian towns and villages in Dalmatia from the Ustaše. Keep in mind, Serbians were the primary enemy to the Axis powers, and the Axis powers were no angels, and yet they had to stop their Croatian allies from committing atrocities. It really speaks volumes when the Nazis themselves were stating in reports that the Ustaše have gone too far. At the heart of this project stood Jasenovac, a vast network of concentration and death camps often referred to as the Auschwitz of the Balkans. Between 1941 and 1945, hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma, and anti-fascist Croatians were murdered there. It's important to note that many Croatians at that time saw Serbians as their kin, believing that blood ties were stronger than religious differences. Tragically, many Croatians who held these views met their end in Jasenovac as well. The victims were killed in grotesque and unimaginable ways, far too dark to describe in this video. But to give you some sense of the brutality, even German SS officers stationed nearby were appalled. Lieutenant Colonel von Wedel described how Croatians were killing women and children like cattle in bestial executions. German observers noted that the Ustaše methods were often more sadistic than efficient, meaning that killings were frequently carried out manually, using hand tools rather than industrialized methods like those at Auschwitz. Unfortunately, Jasenovac isn't widely known globally or remembered like other concentration camps, even among Croatians themselves. For those Croatians who are aware, this legacy remains deeply divisive. To some, the Ustaše were patriots who had at least tried to establish independence. To others, they were fascist butchers who forever stained the Croatian cause with genocide. But while some debate in Croatia the horrors of the Ustaše and Jasenovac, the vast majority, however, have no qualms continuing to call out fascist slogans and attend right-wing concerts that promote the Ustaše ideals. The most recent example is the Thompson concert on the 5th of July 2025, where 450,000 people attended, meaning one of the largest concerts in European history. This concert, performed by Marko Perković, or more commonly known by his stage name, Thompson, was riddled with Ustaše themes, symbols, and salutes. For example, Za dom spremni salute, which translates to "For the homeland ready," a slogan tied to the Ustaše regime. Critics accused the concert of glorifying Croatian ultranationalism and normalizing fascist symbols, with media reporting Nazi-style salutes during the show. The event also sparked debate about state support and public resources being used for such a polarizing event, deepening concerns in Croatia over how to handle its wartime past and national identity. It's also not surprising, after everything discussed in this video, that the Catholic Church was involved with the concert as well, where a priest, antepavelić, comes out to hold a sermon during the show. Just take that in, a priest comes out to hold a sermon during an ultra-nationalist concert. What we need to understand is, history doesn't end neatly, and in fact, in a lot of ways, it continues to bleed forward, especially in Southeastern Europe. From the bomb blasts in Sydney to the massacres at Jasenovac to the chants echoing in modern concerts, the same threads keep surfacing. But look closely, and what you see isn't a people naturally destined for brutality. Croatians, who have been shaped by centuries of foreign influence, were taught to see their own reflection only through the mirror of Catholic Europe. Catholicism in this story was a tool of permanent presence, a force that convinced Croatians their survival depended on rejecting what was closest to them, their own kin, the Serbians. Instead of embracing what was real, what was near, they were blinded into clinging to something imposed, something foreign, until identity itself hardened into dogma. And that's the tragedy. By trying to hold on to themselves, Croatians were led to surrender the most authentic parts of who they are. The question that lingers is whether Croatians, or any of us really, can ever untangle who we are from the forces that once conquered us. But perhaps the answer is to look at those who never allowed themselves to be subdued to permanent presence in the first place for inspiration. Thank you all for listening to the very end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And of course, ciao for now.